Hello, my name is Cameron Sabat, and welcome to Cutting to the Case. Today we're joined by Dr. Robert M. Califf, cardiologist, clinical researcher, and two-time commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, serving under both Presidents Obama and Biden. He led the FDA from 2016 to 2017, and again from 2022 to 2025. Dr. Califf is one of the most influential figures in modern clinical research. He was the founding director of the Duke Clinical Research Institute, helping build Duke into a global center for large-scale clinical trials, and has authored more than 1,300 peer-reviewed publications. He's also a member of the National Academy of Medicine. Between his FDA tenures, he worked on health strategy at Alphabet, including Verily and Google Health. He returned to Duke following his second FDA term and is currently affiliated with Duke's Division of Cardiology and DCRI. Thank you so much for joining today.
Good to be with you.
Absolutely. So, I wanted to start out with the question that's on everyone's mind, which is you've spent your career moving between clinical medicine, research, technology, and government. How has each of these perspectives changed the way you think about what actually improves patient outcomes?
Well, I, it has been quite an experience to have worked in almost every sector. The largest period of time I spent was as a coronary care unit director, and a practicing cardiologist. That's still really my home base. And I guess I would say we live in a system, particularly here in the United States, which is fragmented. Each element plays an important role, and each sector is full of good people trying to do the best they can. But the way the system is currently configured, the whole is a lot less than the sum of the parts. So it's sort of a mixed picture for me. I have the experience of being inspired. If you're in the patient care arena, the inspiration is direct when you interact with people who need their health problems attended to. When you're developing new drugs and devices, the amazing things that happen when something really works and can save lives or change quality of life. And of course, in government, you're impacting large numbers of people with every decision. And, in the tech sector, probably still underappreciated is a direct effect of social media and the way technology works on the way people think and make decisions
Mhm.
about their health. So it's all exciting, all full of good people, all hardworking people. But we got a problem in the U.S. right now about how it all fits together because we're not optimizing healthy longevity at this point.
Yes, unfortunately not. And I wanted to also ask about your service as FDA commissioner. You've served twice, nearly a decade apart. Do you know what was fundamentally different about leading the FDA the second time?
Well, the first time I basically was at a phase in my career was sort of I thought of it as almost like the pre-retirement last act of my career was to go to the FDA as a civil servant initially, and then President Obama asked me to be commissioner, which is a political appointment. And that was a wonderful experience, stressful, but everything I've done in my career has been stressful. That's not a problem for me. It's just a really amazing opportunity. And then I was given the chance to come back to Duke and start a data science center with some collaborators, but also to work half-time at Alphabet or Google being the dominant revenue generating part of Alphabet. And I was having a wonderful time there. It was like being a kid in a candy store. Then the pandemic hit, and I got a call asking me to come back to the FDA. So it was totally different the second time around in terms of the issues that were dominant. It was right in the middle of the Omicron wave of the pandemic. So very, very intense. What was the same was just being in a place where your mission is when you get up in the morning is health and well-being of the people of the United States. And the fact that is in the FDA commissioner role and across the FDA, you see everything that's going on in technology And let's not forget about food, a really hot topic right now as we're speaking. Um, so that was common, and the people just were really great both times. But the pandemic, is a once in a lifetime event, and there I was in the middle of it, having the opportunity to help make decisions in very difficult circumstances.
I can't imagine. Yes. And when the FDA evaluates a new drug, how do you think about the trade-off between getting potentially transformative therapies to patients quickly and making sure the evidence is strong enough?
Well, when we talk about, you know, I would say the drugs get the most publicity in terms of FDA function, but it's only a part of the FDA. And when we talk specifically about drugs, um, there's a long history of laws and legal cases that set the evidentiary standards, and it's not the same for every drug. And there's a good reason for that. If you take a field like mine, cardiology, and you take the big part of cardiology like coronary disease, we have a number of effective treatments already. So the evidentiary standard is very, very high. You typically need a large outcome trial with long-term follow-up. But if you take a rare genetic disease with a very high mortality and no effective treatments, people have um, expressed their views, and this is parents and people with the diseases, that they're willing to take more risk. And so over the years, there's been a set of accelerated pathways put into law by Congress that have a different evidentiary standard. It can be confusing to people because legally, technically, the standard is the same, adequate and well-controlled clinical studies, but in the different circumstances, the ability to use unvalidated surrogates, for example, in rare disease is something that you wouldn't do in a common disease that already has effective treatments. And so, no matter how you look at it, although there is a standard in law, um, every case is different. And in my view, this is why the U.S. system of evaluating drugs and devices has been the gold standard for the world because it's been done by civil servants who have no financial conflict of interest, but have a great deal of knowledge and built into this is the fact that the FDA does its own analysis of the data, which is unique for a regulatory agency around the world. So the whole world, in many ways, depends on the analyses that FDA does. People have said, well, I know a better way of doing it, but I can't think of a better way than having people without a financial conflict and with a lot of knowledge looking at the data and making an informed judgment, which might look different in different circumstances, but typically I would say it happens that way for good reason. Just one other way to think about this, we're getting ready to enter college football season or in football season where Americans, regardless of political affiliation, talk about sports. And I think the sporting analogy for the FDA, in my view, is the FDA is a referee. It's not the coach. It's not the team owner. The FDA doesn't write the rules. The rules are written by the Congress and the executive branch of the government. The FDA applies the rules to individual cases. And so I commonly hear people say, why doesn't the FDA do this or that? Well, the answer is because the FDA can't pass laws. The FDA depends on elected people elected by you, the public, to write the laws. But it's also the case, if you think about um, the way referees function in sports, there are rules of the game, but the application of the rules depends on judgment. And often the referees will have points of emphasis. In basketball, it might be the block charge call is a common one, where it looks a little different depending on the year. And in the same way, the FDA has some leeway within the rules, but it's just critical to remember that if you want different rules, you got to elect different people.
Yes, yes, I agree. And it all comes back to civic engagement, being able to elect. And I'm curious when you talk about evidence-based, um, the FDA is the referee. Have we become too dependent on randomized control trials as the gold standard, or are there areas where real-world evidence can give us equally actionable answers?
Well, let's talk a little bit about terminology here. So I'm going to start out by saying I think we're not dependent enough on randomized controlled trials. We need to do more, not less.
Hmm.
But we also need to take advantage of the fact that we now live in a datafied environment and we have tools like artificial intelligence, of course, computation of various types, and the ability now to look at it, the human experience over time through electronic health record, claims data, digital information from wearable devices, cell phone information, all of that. And, my career started with a database doing observational comparisons in coronary disease in the 1970s.
Hmm.
But I quickly learned that when you cause and effect, for the most part, you need to have randomization inference. Um, but here's where people evidence is data in real world evidence. Real world data refers to data collected everywhere except in a specific research clinic. Um, and so it encompasses all these various kinds of data. And that's real world data has been used forever by the FDA. And when you go to design a clinical study, sometimes you'll have a research clinic where you get part of the data and the rest of it you may get from the electronic health record or other kinds of data. To the construction of a study, the analysis of the data. And so I think the most underused method that we have today is pragmatic clinical trials, that is, randomized trials done in the real world that are fully
Hmm.
representative of the populations to be treated. And I think we're going to see a great increase in the use of that technology. It's just an application of a method to real world data. So people tend to say you got real world evidence and randomized trials. They're polar opposites. That's not true. Um, you have traditional randomized trials, you have pragmatic randomized trials, you have observational comparisons. There's a spectrum there. But randomization itself says nothing about the kind of data that you use. It's a method to be able to draw an inference.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
I was sort of spoiled. I started out in the 1980s as a CCU attending right when we figured out what caused heart attacks. And you obviously can't take a heart attack patient and say, why don't you come back to the research clinic, when we have an appointment and we'll collect all this data. We had to collect the data in the real world. But we learned quickly you had to randomize to get a reliable answer as to whether there was a treatment effect. That was a long-winded answer, but it sort of, maybe in a way, it sort of summarizes my work in almost every sector, even in clinical practice. Um, you know, it's important to distinguish when we really know what the best treatment is and when we're applying our best judgment in the absence of the knowledge that we'd like to have. And we used to have a saying back in those early days of doing the big randomized trials in heart attack, the relentless pursuit of evidence. And when we don't know, I think the best form of clinical practice is to participate in a clinical trial and get the answer.
Hmm. Hmm. And you You've spent decades thinking about the American clinical trial system at large, too. You even helped build the Duke Clinical Research Institute and have spent um, a lot of time thinking about this. If you could redesign this whole system from scratch, what would you change?
Well, I mean, for fun, let's compare it to Google. So a tool that everyone in the world essentially has used at one time or another and still has billions of users. One of the things that happened at Google very early on was the use of A/B comparisons, which is a randomized comparison. So when you wanted to do something important at Google with its website, you had to design a study. Google had the advantage that it could randomize millions of people in an hour, but the outcome was ad revenue over time. Hopefully, not the outcome we're looking for in medicine, but it has some of the same characteristics that we need in medicine for clinical outcome trials. You're looking at um, a, a way of portraying a computer screen A and B, and then you're following all the people that saw A. You randomly allocate who sees which one, then you follow them over time and see how much ad revenue is generated. You have people who drop out, you have people who cross over, you have missingness of various types. All that needs to be accounted for. And so the view at Google was you shouldn't make an important business decision without the best form of evidence or what would be useful. And you can see the result of that. They've done pretty well. So it's sort of baffling that in medicine and healthcare, we're willing to just say, gee, I don't really know, but I'll give it my best guess based on what I know as a doctor. I'm all for that over just a complete best guess. But in other words, I'd rather have a good doctor than just someone who thought about it 10 seconds ago on a podcast. But the best of all would be a doctor armed with high quality evidence. It was sort of hard to think that way until recently because electronic health records were still so clumsy. But we're really getting into an era now with AI where data can be aggregated, it um, can be cleaned up much more quickly, and I'm hopeful that we'll see a system where we're constantly learning in real time and then applying clinical trials in that context in the real world when we don't know the answer to a question.
Mhm.
And if you really want to get far out, I mean, sort of a fun concept that's evolving now that we're going to need to get used to is sort of a tripartite system of AI agents. I mean, I personally now use open evidence. I think like 80% of American doctors do. So that is AI giving us completely up to the millisecond synthesis of information from journals and clinical practice guidelines that we can interrogate through asking questions or typing questions. I have an agent combing my electronic health record now to find things that don't look right or need attention. And once that, that's in prototype mode now, but once it becomes available, imagine a world where we have all the evidence and we have an agent looking at our record to see what the recommendations are. And then we look at that across millions of people. We can begin to have a real-time evidence generation system that might even tell us when we need to do a clinical trial, and then we can all work together on it. Now, no, the next question people say is, are you saying we don't need doctors? No, I think we'll need doctors more than we ever have because the human condition is so complicated and multifactorial. We're going to discover all kinds of things that have been unattended or glossed over just because people are busy. I don't know
Yes.
about you, but you're probably young enough not to have to worry about this. But at age 70, almost 75, my health record is, hundreds of pages long. There's no human being that can actually go through all that and read it, but an agent can do it in a few minutes.
Yeah.
And so I really think we have an amazing opportunity coming up to take all these concepts that we were thinking about in the 1970s and were frustrations of clinical practice for someone like me, but now put them in to make clinical practice really better than it otherwise could have possibly been.
Yes, yes, of course. And I'm also very curious, what did, well, I suppose, how should the clinical trials that we're discussing remain extraordinarily expensive and slow? Do you think there's any source of inefficiency that we could realistically eliminate?
Yeah, so I go back to what I just said as part of it. I think, um, and I think it's really important when we talk about expensive and slow. One part of slow that I know everyone would like to do away with, but may not ever go away, is that for chronic diseases or even long-term effects of interventions in rare disease, um, the time dimension is really important. I learned about this very early in my career. I was looking at coronary bypass surgery and medical treatment. I know for young people, hard to imagine, but we didn't have percutaneous intervention when I started out. It didn't even exist. And what you saw in that case was if you got coronary bypass surgery, you had a much higher risk of dying in the first week, but then the curves crossed. So if you had only looked at the first week, you'd say never do this operation. If you looked a year later, you'd say in high risk people with extensive coronary disease, it saves a lot of lives over time. Well, so we got to keep in mind that we're gonna the one part of the time dimension we can't alter, which is that biology evolves over time. And we're talking about preventive interventions now that you might start at age 20 with to prevent bad things from happening at age 50. So we're going to need these long-term slow trials. But there's another element of it. Expensive and slow in terms of how long it takes to enroll. What I just described before in terms of agents crawling electronic records and evidence synthesis occurring in real time gives us a chance to use um, that technological power to give people the opportunity to participate all around the world almost in real time. And if we do the trials in the context of clinical practice, a lot of the expenses because we add all kinds of unnecessary procedures and tests to clinical trials that don't really help that much. We looked while I was commissioner, we looked at antibiotic trials, which in intensive care units, and over 90% of the data was never looked at by anybody. But there was this view you had to collect every medication. And if you think about an ICU, with the way we could collect medicines 10 years ago, which was essentially by hand from a written record, it was just impossible. Well, now we don't necessarily have to simplify because we got digital data for all of that. But we could really reduce the cost by applying AI to a lot of processes that occur in clinical trials now that could be greatly shortened. And we can improve enrollment by using the technology that we have. The impediment is no longer the technology, it's the people. So we have to get into a different mindset to make this work. What I really object to is for people to say, well, clinical trials are expensive and take too long, so let's just take a shortcut. Well, the consequence of taking a shortcut can be really serious. Remember that 9 out of 10 drugs that get into phase one, for example, don't make it to market because the benefits don't outweigh the risk when we do the clinical trials.
Yes.
So I don't think we want to be guessing about that.
Hmm.
We could hurt a lot of people by putting things on the market based on shortcuts.
Hmm. Yes. And could you maybe share a little bit also about not just the not just the efficiency side of things, but also the cost? So what did being FDA commissioner teach you about the relationship between pharmaceutical innovation and drug affordability? Can we substantially lower prices without weakening incentives to develop new medicines?
That's a really complicated question. The first thing to say is I agree with the American principle that the FDA should not be involved in cost decisions for pharmaceuticals. But I do think the government should be. I think that the concept that you evaluate the risks and benefits based on the science is really core to the FDA not being a political organization, but being a science organization. But if the benefits outweigh the risks, what it costs and what people are willing to pay for it, it's a very important question. And a lot of the big clinical trials in my heyday that I used to be PI on built in cost effectiveness analysis as part of the trial. So I do think CMS and potentially other government agencies should be very involved in pricing. And I think we've already seen that when the power, a direct result of legislation that Biden finally put through with the opposition of the pharmaceutical industry. Now, you could also ask the question, what drives the price? And just a little bit here of a perspective that I think people need to, in my view, people need to understand better. 94% of prescriptions in the US today are generic, and our generic drug prices are actually lower than prices anywhere else in the world among high-income countries. So we have this system where when you invent a new drug, you get this patent protection, which is essentially giving you a monopoly on that market for a period of time. Then it goes generic, and you're in a dog-eat-dog business of who can produce the same molecule at the lowest price. There are even some issues on the generic side, like we have a lot of drug shortages now because the price has gotten so low that people say, I can't afford to make it, so they just go out of business. This happened during my term to an essential cancer drug, cisplatin, which is an absolutely essential cancer drug. But the price got so low that they couldn't even make it in India, where the labor costs are as low as you can get for for the price. On the innovator side, where the prices are high, I do think the business of charging Americans a lot more than other countries is not a good thing. I'd also say that Americans should pay more than the average country because we're wealthier than the average country. So we got to find a better sweet spot. And I don't think that's the FDA's job. I think it really is a CMS job. And it will only happen if Congress changes the laws so that the negotiating power can come into play.
Yes, yes. And it really comes down to what the elected officials will do as well. It can't all be done at the FDA level as well. I mean, um, so it becomes tricky then. And I am curious as well, um, where do you think artificial intelligence will change medicine rather than just simply making existing processes more efficient? I mean, you've spent time at Google Health and Verily, so
Yeah, I mean, it's unpredictable. We'll go through these cycles of radical enthusiasm and then disappointment. Right now, just this week, there's a lot of disappointment from people who thought things like drug discovery would be revolutionized overnight. And there's some great articles this week from people that have been working on it that about how hard it is. But I do think, if you just think about driving a car as an example, we're going to go through the same sort of evolution in medicine where algorithms will do all the things that algorithms can do better.
Mhm.
So you don't really I don't know about you, but I don't know of anyone who, as they're driving down the road, is trying to figure out how to explain why maps or Siri is telling you to turn right here or pointing out there's a wreck ahead, so take this alternate route. That's all artificial intelligence working. I think we'll see the same thing in medicine. It will get better. The hard part is how does a human being coexist with this new capability? And um, I, I mean, one way that I've thought about it a lot, going way back for me, is when I was a medical student in 1976. My mentor, Eugene Stead, used to pull me aside on rounds and say, "Listen to this. They're treating these people as if memorizing facts is what doctors should do." And he would say, "It's all in the textbook. The facts are. And soon it's going to all be in computers." Well, of course, now with open evidence, it really is all in computers. The question is not can you memorize things? The question is what can you do with the information which is now at your fingertips and also at the same time at the fingertips of the patient that you're seeing. Exactly the same information. Significant changes. And I'm optimistic that it will be for the better in the long run, but there'll be some bumps along the road.
Yes, yes. And as with every new technology, there are going to be pluses and minuses as we move along as well. I obviously I want to be respectful of your time here. Um, just a final question for our audience, though. Do you have any words of wisdom or advice to share with our audience of early career professionals and young medical students?
Well, I think for those who want to go into a clinical role, whether it's a medical student, a nurse, a PA, a pharmacist, um, I think it's going to be increasingly important that you love interacting with your fellow human beings. And there are other roles that relate to medicine and drug development where you can go work in a lab and you don't have to interact with your fellow human beings. But for the reasons that I've given today, I think that the sort of doctor as a repository of information, that day is rapidly going away. But the doctor as a someone with whom you can interact to figure out what to do with the information, that's where the action is going to be. And that takes wisdom. It takes a tolerance for human misery. It takes the ability to deal with people in a respectful way, even if you disagree with what they've done or who they stand for or what they've chosen to do with their lives that got them into the predicament that they're in. So I think the human qualities are going to be the place to focus. And if you don't love doing that, probably ought to think about doing something different. But if you love it, it could be a great time.
I agree. I agree. And really that speaks to the power of still being sociable and being able to interact with people and empathize with them at their toughest moments. I mean, medical school really beats a lot of drugs and pharmaceutical, mechanisms into your head, but we can't lose sight of the broader goal here, which is patient care. So,
Yeah, I think at least my view of it is that even the most intelligent, rational person, when their health is threatened, it's very hard for them to be cold and rational and weighing the options.
mhm.
They need someone to help them do that, and that's a really important role. There'll also always be a role, I think, for the foreseeable future for a proceduralist. They don't necessarily have to be like, I'm not sure I need the most compassionate surgeon. I want my surgeon to be really good at surgery. But um, I think compassion and being able to get along with fellow human beings is going to be the dominant issue.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much for joining Cutting to the Case today. I really appreciate it.
You bet. Take care.
You're an inspiration. Thank you so much. This is Cameron Sabat signing off.